Well, good day to you and welcome as we ponder another aspect of our evolving United Church of Canada history. And once again this week, our approach is a little less linear than it will be on some topics. What we're going to be doing is dipping into a variety of places to give us the flavor of a rich and varied story, the evolving place of women in the United Church of Canada. And I have three focusing questions for us to keep in mind in this little presentation. Why did women's groups appear? What did they offer their members above and beyond regular church life? And why did they thrive? Excellent books have been written about the Women's Association, the Women's Missionary Society, and the UCW, the United Church Women. And there is a flood of articles. And I don't plan to rehearse all of that, but I do want to draw out a few things that are significant. The first thing to note is that it may be difficult from the perspective of the second decade of the 21st century to imagine a society largely without social welfare of any kind. No allowances of any kind, no hospital insurance, no unemployment insurance, no disability funding, no sick leave. But before the existence of those on a societal basis, the women of the church were responding to need and doing Christ's work. They were healing the sick, clothing the naked, housing those without shelter, feeding the hungry, visiting the downtrodden, teaching the marginalized, comforting the bereaved. The Wesleyan Female Benevolent Society of Halifax had the following purpose statement: to relieve the wants, assuage the griefs, and mitigate the suffering of many of the wretched and destitute of our fellow creatures. And so this group, organized as early as 1816 to cope with the severe economic depression that hit Halifax following the Napoleonic Wars, was made up of society members who distributed clothing that they had made themselves, blankets and food packages, all going to households where breadwinners were either unemployed or absent. They sought donations of money and goods from local merchants, and in the first year of their existence, the society had collected over $1,000. Now, that's a truly significant sum. It's equal to about $25,000 today. In that period, a skilled tradesperson was earning about $2 a day. So, $1,000 is a lot of money. Not only had they raised the money, they had relieved 300 distressed situations. Within the first 2 years, the Society's charity had been extended to thousands, Methodists and non Methodists alike. They served communities in times of need, but they also extended their work beyond the local context. For instance, maritime women sent support in the form of barrels of clothes and salt cods to the prairie provinces in times of drought, and this enormous relief effort was largely based on the organizing drive of a single woman, Annie Ignatieff, who was the president of the Presbyterial Women's Association in Assiniboine Presbytery. Now, at various times of economic distress and collapse, many people would literally not have survived, dignity intact, without the efforts of these women. Soup kitchens and bread lines were often organized on an ecumenical basis. Blankets, clothing, and fuel were provided to those unable to attain such necessities of life on their own. And other church women taught their sisters how to sew, provided fabric and patterns so that women could sew clothes for their families and perhaps earn a little money to add to very meager household funds. If we move forward in history and look at the two world wars, we see women doing a major role in organizing to support the war effort. And while this may challenge some of our more pacifist inclinations, the reality of the national effort was truly immense. Bandages were made by every women's group in the country for distribution by the Red Cross. Soldiers received packages from home with baked goods, preserves, homemade delicacies, hand knitted socks, and caps. Soldiers and sailors in Canada were taken in, and in places like Halifax and Vancouver, there is a rich local memory of activities organized for thousands of men torn away from their homes, organized by the church. These women cheered the return of their local soldiers after the war, and in many communities set up special groups to welcome the war brides who came with the returning soldiers. They responded to local disasters with generosity and creativity. The history book of First St. Andrew's Church in London, Ontario, tells of flooding when a breakwater was broken through during the 1930s. The women of the congregation ran a dining room, a nursery in the parlor, and made over clothing for their unexpected guests on sewing machines set up in the boardroom. And similar stories could be repeated over and over again with local variations throughout Canada. Now, some of those groups formed with very conscious response to Christ's call. This is evident in some of their purpose statements: to serve God and fellow man, to visit the sick and the needy, to help lighten another's burdens by kindly deeds. The impact of individual women and women's groups on church and society cannot be overstated, although it's only in the last 20 to 30 years that large numbers of historians have taken up the investigation into the records, particularly for the church. Women tend to be very modest about their contributions to the church, writes one feminist historian. There is, of course, the role of women in the social gospel and the temperance movement that we've looked at before, not because of any particular puritanical moral stance around drinking, but because of a concern about social needs. The rapidly increasing consumption of liquor was evidently at the root of significant problems, particularly for women and children who suffered the results in abuse and lack of financial resources for basic necessities. In 1895, the president of the local Women's Missionary Society in PEI wrote, "Canada spends $80 million on liquor, an average of $16 per capita, while against that, Canada gives only $500,000 to mission, which amounts to 10 cents per capita," which may give us an appreciation of the extent and the scope of the problem. Members of women's groups began to gather for issues around world peace, and after many years of praying together, the Interdenominational Day of Prayer for Mission began officially in 1918 and gathered for collective prayer in World War I and II. In 1922, Canadian women joined with American sisters, and the Women's World Day of Prayer, today simply called World Day of Prayer, became a truly international event. Now, these are all pre-union events in most cases, but these are women who are making statements about peace within their congregations. For the greater part of the 19th century, most Canadian women had no access to formal education, with the exception of those ornamental graces which prepared her for what was seen as the woman's highest sphere, that of wife and mother. Mount Allison University was the first Canadian institution to admit women to bachelor's level studies, and it, of course, has a Methodist and later United Church of Canada foundation. It was that institution that granted the first Bachelor of Science and English Literature degree to Grace Annie Lockhart in 1875. In a society that discouraged women from formal education, an interest in missions provided a possible, if somewhat unconscious, countercultural outlet. Women with inquiring minds could make the prevailing values work in their favor. They gathered together and they learned about missionaries and the countries to which they had gone. Antigonish women, for example, had been interested in missions since at least 1846, when one of their sisters, Charlotte MacDonald Getty, sailed with her husband to the New Hebrides. So, when the women when the minister called the women together in 1878 and suggested the formation of an auxiliary of the Halifax Women's Foreign Missionary Society, response was unanimous support. In 1941, the women of St. Andrew's Church in Toronto formed two book clubs that took very seriously the women's need for intellectual stimulation. Education is a child of religion is a famous quote, and that has certainly been true in the United Church. Until the 20th century, the church was virtually the only acceptable context in which a woman could stretch their intellectual framework. Women liberated themselves through studies, both of the Bible and of other sources. Women began to develop trust in their own interpretation. New groups formed in the 21st centuries may be entering uncharted areas, but they continue the trajectory of women pushing the boundaries as they seek to grow, and doing that through organizations in the church. Church women's organizations also met the need for socialization. In a society where most women did not go outside the home to work, they often found themselves isolated. Church women's organizations met a crucial need for social connection. In rural communities, particularly, these groups formed the means of social support, particularly for women trapped in abusive marriage. They were also supportive in response to sickness, bereavement, death, and so on, and often did so behind the scenes. And where the men found themselves unwilling or unable to accept the support of others, women handled those difficult times in much healthier fashion. Church women organized, planned, and cooked and served several community suppers throughout the year all across Canada. And those would be the social highlights of the year. They would attract people from across the community, regardless of denominational affiliation. And this was particularly true and vitally important in farming communities where families were often living at some distance from their neighbors, and women and children suffered significant isolations. Mothers' groups sprang up regularly so that they could aid one another with the challenges of child rearing. When we put the concept of community for church women in the center of our consideration, we also understand why quilting was a popular focus. Gathered around the quilt frame, there was ample opportunity for socializing. It was both productive and therapeutic. Less acknowledged at the time was the role of women within the political sphere. It was not something that women were supposed to engage in. And of course, this is an evolving issue depending on where we dip into the historical record. The status of women in church evolved, but it certainly began without any official status. Forming a special interest group for women was a consciously political act. The women of the Halifax Wesleyan Women's Society could have come together informally to conduct their charitable work. Money could have been raised, missions supported, and friendly visits made without a formal structure. But the women consciously chose to gather under a particular name as a continuing presence, not only in their congregation, but within the entire Methodist Conference. Now, imagining some of these groups as political radicals and subversives may be a stretch for you, but in the 19th century, they were exactly that, and they were very carefully watched over by clergy and laymen alike. One minister, after opening the women's meeting with prayer, since women were not allowed to pray in public at this time, he was invited by the women to leave, and he declined as saying, "No one would know what they would pray for if I left them alone." Now, that was written about a women's meeting in 1811 in the United States, but Canada in that time was very little different in attitudes. A very daring idea for women in that day was that they could draw up rules and even have a name. That was the response to the Wesleyan Women's Society that I mentioned earlier. There was heated debate after a mothers' meeting was organized in 1900 to do Women's Christian Temperance Union work. It was denounced by people in the press. One self-identified Methodist man, writing, quote, "for the good of society," commented that this was entirely inappropriate for women to do. There were also the times when women struggled with the church board or wanted the permission of the session to hold bridal showers. In other areas of church life, they struggled particularly with the prevailing attitude that they were non-primary human beings who, in the proper ordering of things, should continue to devote themselves to the support and comfort of those human beings who were considered primary, namely their husbands and fathers. So when we consider the social context, it's quite astonishing what women accomplished. It is with a growing sense of their own calling and mission and empowerment that we begin to see the development of different structures and quite deliberate and often very creative strategies to overcome gender discrimination. For example, the issue of inclusive language is one that Methodist women in 1906 would have been familiar with. At the Methodist General Council, that was the national gathering, in 1894, the presidents of the Ladies' Aid were admitted to quarterly board meetings, and in 1906 a motion was introduced to change the term from layman to lay member, which would automatically admit women to church courts. This move was defeated, but only by 42 votes, so times they were a-changing. Organizations and structures strengthened the role of women in church, both individually and collectively. The first women to sit on sessions and boards were usually there as representatives of their own groups, and many congregations did not admit them as members in their own right until much later. The United Church Women was formed in 1962, and the participation of women in decision-making bodies was written into the United Church Manual. So while the church was dominated in numbers by women, its leadership was dominated by men until comparatively recently, but the change was beginning to occur. One of the features of the women's movement was their continuing ability to generate funds, sharply contradicting the societal myth that women had no heads for money. The fact that the myth continued for so long in spite of the ability for women is perhaps testimony to how deeply it was lodged in some parts of the popular psyche, including amongst some women. The many ways to use to raise money simply boggle the imagination. Quilting, book sales, rummage sales, bazaar, plant sales, economy stores, auctions, catering, church and community suppers, and the list goes on and on. But despite the evidence to the contrary, women in the time did not see themselves as engaged in business, nor does the local church or national seem to have truly given credit for the scope of what was being undertaken. And so what we see when we look carefully is a unique blending of creativity, initiative, and faith. For instance, they wrote cookbooks, then had them printed and sent out, generating what might seem like individually small amounts of money. But they were constantly generating those funds, and certainly many congregations would not exist without those efforts. The care and upkeep of churches and manses often fell to them, scrubbing floors, polishing brass, washing windows, and so on. When the Women's Foreign Missionary Society Western Division was formed by Presbyterians in 1876, some ministers actually expressed the fear that their congregational finances would suffer because the women's focus would be elsewhere. That didn't happen. Like their American sisters, Canadian women developed the habit of double giving. The fear of the clergy, however, sincerely meant, suggests a more deeply held fear that organizations engaged in God's work would be competitive rather than supportive of the church. That's a particularly harsh judgment on generations of church women who simply did not have access to the structures of the church. Therefore, they had to heed the call to mission in other ways, in other forms. The doubts that churchmen had about these organizations were quickly challenged by the remarkable ability that women showed both in administration and in fundraising without disrupting local fundraising. Money and all that it accomplishes was tangible evidence that women had an active and meaningful place in the church, and it was important as a source of self esteem. But that reality did not quickly lead to women's involvement in the leadership of the church overall. Another major recipient of the role of women as fundraisers has been the Mission and Service Fund, and the United Church Women has long held the M&S Fund as a major focus and supported it strongly. Considering that through much of this period women had little access to money of their own, the amounts that they have been able to raise for church and missions is really quite astounding. For most women, it was not a matter of transferring money earned elsewhere to church coffers, but turning wit, skills, imagination, and raw materials into cold, hard cash. Domestic skills such as cooking, sewing, knitting became major sources of income, raising literally millions of dollars. Some enterprising groups moved their operations outside the church, for example, catering at local and community and church functions, operating second-hand clothing stores on a full-time basis. They developed creative ideas for money raising without a large initial cash outlay. Periodic penny per inch waistline measurements were done in some groups, or they issued sunshine bags into which members put pennies on nice days. A traveling apron went from person to person, and each woman sewed a coin into it. The Sunday Egg Project of a group of women in Manitoba paid for the creation of a basement in their church, and the list goes on. And so, what we're seeing in broad strokes is the use of particular domestic skills, which in the time were not highly valued in a male dominated society. But as a whole, they became resources for life giving activities for women's organizations. Now, in many cases, the money earned was still handed over to the church men to be spent. This was done and initially does not seem to have raised any comment or protest. In the records of the Victoria Church, we read, quote, "The products of the Thanksgiving fowl supper are always turned over to the church treasurer by the UCW, a gallant band of hard-working women who do much towards the upkeep of the church and the manse." End of quotation. Disposition of money in this way was not as problematic in those days as it certainly would be today when women have the opportunity to be parts of boards and committees and trustees. But for the most part, in that period we are considering, this was not the case. Some congregations, for example, have only in this century elected their first women as trustees. And so we also find examples of women pushing back against the prevailing expectations. For instance, we read in the minutes of a women's group in Kamloops, BC in 1925 the following motion: that the board of managers ask the men to take the congregational social in hand, as the energy of the women was being taken up with preparations for the bazaar. End of quotation. These women apparently felt comfortable telling the manager what to do, but that doesn't seem to have been widespread. Establishing a separate funds for monies raised by women's group was another tactic, and when the board asked to borrow money from the UCW, the women would occasionally say no and establish a separate fund for those things that they value. However, women who attempted to form study groups free of fundraising activities often met with opposition. That women would get together and to study and not raise funds was considered problematic, and you may have encountered it as a problem still today. In some research papers, the difficulty church women have in curtailing their fundraising activities in order to focus attention and energy elsewhere is quite clearly noted. Nationally, the WMS, the Women's Missionary Society, was a freestanding organization with its own funds, administration, and personnel. They were partners with national church bodies, a status that they largely lost when the Women's Association and the WMS were merged to form the UCW in 1962. While the WA, the Women's Association, had the larger membership, the WMS had a more visible national presence. It was thought that the combination would draw on the strengths of both organizations. However, the conclusion of many observers seems to be that many of the overseas functions of the WMS were simply absorbed by the national church, and hence women lost their direct control and authority over something that had been the lifeblood of a vibrant organization. When we speak of church union, we are also speaking about the uniting of different groups, and we are doing so from the perspective of the United Church. Some of you may wish to do further exploration of the response, particularly in the continuing Presbyterian Church. For many Canadians, the union was a rupture in their church and families. But there is very little written about the union from the perspective of women. Of the 342 official signers of the basis of union, only 4 were women. Unofficially, of course, the women of the churches would have been deeply affected by the intense lobbying activities of both sides. They were the focus of pamphlets like Read and Decide from Montreal Presbytery, which we encountered a couple of weeks ago. They were part of the background conversation even in those places where they did not officially vote. The independent women's organizations in all of the churches were thriving. So any argument from economics or the viewpoint of dwindling numbers and resources would, in fact, not apply to them. In the early years of the 20th century, Canada began to prosper and grow. Immigration rose from 17,000 in 1896 to 200,000 in 1906 and began to include Eastern Europeans, many of whom settled in the prairie provinces, but also found their ways into the cities that began to attract younger immigrants to the better paying jobs in industry. And we have talked about the growth of missions and mission work within Canada. The women were involved in a variety of social organizations, and consensus, cooperation, and local union seems to ensure the easy formation of a new denomination. But of course, we know that the struggle was quite bitter in some places. During the First World War, Canada entered the struggle with the blessings of the denominations, and many congregations, particularly the Methodist Church, established recruiting stations, and sermons encouraged young men to enlist in a holy cause. From one sermon, any young man who did not go to war, but could, was neither a Christian nor a patriot. The war effort involved huge expenditures of effort by women in relief and support roles at home and abroad. The fight for prohibition, led by the Women's Christian Temperance Union, continued with the triumph of Canada becoming completely dry in 1919. The end of the war and the return of troops marked an ongoing change in Canadian society. Increasingly sophisticated manufacturing techniques developed in the 19th century had been used to devastating effect on the battlefield. So the fair and just society of which many had dreamed and for which so many had labored seemed to go by the wayside. They had learned that technology could not only be a force for good, but also for tremendous destruction. The role of the church, particularly in relation to morals, often shifted. Soldiers who had become used to fewer restrictions while overseas were reluctant to surrender their newfound freedoms back to the church that dominated society. The changed role of women in the workforce during the war and the spread of various technical innovations also made major changes to family life and the use of time by women as well. They contributed to a growing sense of independence by women. War accelerated the growing awareness of women as competent persons, as they had taken on crucial roles in industry and commerce. Their contribution to the war effort was particularly significant in winning the Dominion vote in 1917. Canada could no longer deny that women were primary citizens, even if legally they were not yet persons until 1929. In 1936, after a decade of debate, Lydia Grucci was ordained. The controversies over women's roles seems to have raised the consciousness of some congregations because it is during this time that we see the first admission of women to church sessions. So that even while we find vigorous debate and even strong opposition in some places, we see the constant, gradual, but always persistent forward movement of women taking a proper and larger place in the life of church and society. I look forward to our conversation in class.